The chains around Daniel Harper's wrists were cold. They were made of some alien metal that he could not name, and they bit into his skin every time he moved. He had been a prisoner aboard the Volante mothership for 3 long months, and in that time, he had learned to hate the color purple. Everything on this ship was purple. The walls, the floors, the strange lights that never seemed to turn off. Even the food they gave him had a purple tint that made his stomach turn. Daniel was a lieutenant in the Earth colonial fleet, but that title meant nothing here. To the Volante, he was just another human. Just another creature from a young and foolish species that had only recently learned to travel between stars. The Volante had been conquering galaxies when humans were still living in caves. They looked down on humanity the way a grown man might look down on an ant. The guards came for him at what he guessed was midnight. There was no day or night on the ship, but Daniel had learned to track time by the changing of the guard shifts. 2 tall Volante soldiers grabbed him by the arms and dragged him through the winding corridors. Their skin was pale gray, almost silver, and their eyes were solid black with no white at all. They did not speak to him. They never did. Daniel thought about his crew as they walked. 12 good people had been serving aboard the Horizon's Edge when the Volante intercepted them. They had been on a simple supply run to the outer colonies, carrying medicine and machine parts to the settlers on New Canton. It should have been an easy mission. 3 weeks out, 3 weeks back, and then home to Earth for shore leave. But the Volante had appeared out of nowhere. Their ships dropped out of hyperspace like ghosts, surrounding the Horizon's Edge before Daniel could even reach the weapons console. There had been no fight. There had been no chance to fight. The Volante simply took what they wanted, and what they wanted was the crew. Daniel had not seen his people since that first day. The Volante had separated them immediately, sending each crew member to a different section of the massive mothership. He did not know if they were alive or dead. He did not know if they were being tortured or simply forgotten in some dark cell. The not knowing was the worst part. The guards stopped in front of a massive door made of black stone. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly with inner light. Daniel had never seen this door before. In 3 months of imprisonment, he had only ever been taken to his cell, to the feeding hall, and to the medical bay where the Volante doctors ran their endless tests on his body. The door slid open without a sound, and Daniel was pushed into the largest room he had ever seen. It was a throne room. That much was obvious from the raised platform at the far end, where a crystal chair sat beneath a canopy of floating lights. But the room was also a museum, filled with strange objects from 100 different worlds. Daniel saw weapons mounted on the walls, paintings in frames, sculptures of creatures he could not identify. He saw jars filled with glowing liquids and cases displaying jewelry made from metals that seemed to shift color as he watched. And there, on the crystal throne, sat the Empress Seraphel. She was tall, even for a Volante. Her skin was darker than the others, almost charcoal gray, and her black eyes seemed to swallow the light around them. She wore robes of deep red that pooled around her feet like blood, and her long fingers were decorated with rings that sparkled with impossible colors. A crown of twisted silver sat upon her head, rising in points that resembled frozen flames. Daniel had heard stories about Seraphel during his imprisonment. The guards sometimes talked when they thought he could not understand their language, not knowing that the translator chip in his neck worked both ways. He had learned that Seraphel had ruled the Volante Empire for over 800 years. He had learned that she had conquered 17 star systems through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and strategic marriages. He had learned that she collected rare and interesting things from every world she conquered. And now, apparently, she had decided that Daniel was interesting enough to collect. The Empress rose from her throne and descended the steps slowly. Her movements were graceful, almost hypnotic, like a snake uncoiling before a strike. She circled Daniel twice, studying him from every angle, and he forced himself to stand straight despite the weight of his chains. "You are the captain of the human vessel," SciFi said. Her voice was soft but carried easily through the enormous room. "The one who tried to send the warning signal before we disabled your communications." Lieutenant, Daniel corrected her. "I am a lieutenant. And yes, I tried to warn New Canton. That is my job." SciFi smiled, and Daniel saw that her teeth were sharp and pointed like a predator's. "Your loyalty to your species is admirable," she said. "It is also useful to me." She returned to her throne and sat down, arranging her robes carefully before speaking again. "My fleet is preparing to strike the human colony you call New Canton. We will arrive in 6 standard days. When we do, we will burn the settlement to the ground. 30,000 of your people will die." Daniel felt his heart freeze in his chest. He had feared this from the moment of his capture, but hearing it spoken aloud made it terribly real. New Canton was a farming colony. The people there were not soldiers. They were families, children, old folks who had retired to spend their final years under an alien sun. Why? Daniel asked, his voice rough. "What has New Canton ever done to you?" SciFi waved one hand dismissively. "Nothing. They are simply in the way of our expansion. Their world has resources we desire, and removing them is more efficient than negotiating with them." She leaned forward, and her black eyes seemed to bore into Daniel's soul. "But I am offering you a chance to save them, human. I will give you a ship. I will give you a head start. You can reach New Canton before my fleet and warn them to evacuate. 30,000 lives saved because of you." Daniel stared at her, waiting for the trap. There was always a trap with the Volanthi. "What do you want in return?" SciFi's smile widened. "I have many prisoners aboard this ship. Humans, Volanthi dissidents, members of a dozen other species. All I ask is that you choose one woman from among them to remain behind. She will serve as a permanent addition to my court, a companion for my advisors, a symbol of my generosity in letting you go." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. She was asking him to condemn someone. She was asking him to look at a living, breathing person and decide that her freedom was worth less than his own. "You have until morning to decide," SciFi said, settling back into her throne. "Choose wisely, human. 30,000 lives depend on your answer." The guards grabbed Daniel's arms and dragged him away. And the last thing he saw before the great door closed was the Empress watching him with those terrible black eyes, a smile of dark amusement playing across her alien face. The cell was dark and cold, but Daniel did not notice. He sat on the hard metal floor with his back against the wall, staring at nothing, his mind racing in circles that led nowhere good. The chains had been removed when the guards threw him back into his prison, but he could still feel their weight on his wrists. He suspected he would feel that weight for the rest of his life. 30,000 people. The number kept repeating in his head like a drumbeat. 30,000 men, women, and children on New Canton, going about their lives, planting crops and building homes and dreaming about the future. They had no idea that death was coming for them. They had no idea that their survival now depended on a single man locked in a cell aboard an alien ship. Daniel thought about the faces he had seen during his months of captivity. The Volanthi had not been careful about hiding their other prisoners from him. He had glimpsed them during transfers, during the rare moments when he was marched through the ship's corridors for medical examinations or interrogations that led nowhere. He remembered the elderly human woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She had smiled at him once through the bars of her cell, a sad smile that seemed to say she understood what he was going through. He did not know her name. He did not know where she came from or how long she had been here. But he remembered that smile. He remembered the young Volanthi woman with the strange markings on her face. The guards had treated her roughly, more roughly than they treated the other prisoners, and Daniel had guessed that she was some kind of political enemy to the Empress. A dissident, maybe, or a member of a rival family. Her eyes had been defiant, even in chains, burning with a fire that captivity had not managed to extinguish. And he remembered. Lara Webb. Was his co-pilot aboard the Horizon's Edge. They had served together for 4 years, jumping from star to star, hauling cargo to the outer colonies and back. She was smart and capable, and had saved his life more than once when things went wrong in the black emptiness between worlds. She was also his friend, one of the few true friends he had made in his years of service. Daniel closed his eyes and saw Laura's face clearly in his memory. She had dark brown hair that she always kept tied back in a practical braid. Her eyes were green, the color of summer leaves back on Earth, and they crinkled at the corners when she laughed. She laughed often, or at least she used to, before the Volanti came. Lara had a daughter. Her name was Sophie, and she was 7 years old. Daniel had never met Sophie in person, but he felt like he knew her from all the stories Lara had told during their long voyages. Sophie loved strawberry ice cream and hated math homework. She wanted to be a starship pilot like her mother when she grew up. She had a stuffed animal, a purple rabbit named Captain Floppy, that she slept with every night. Sophie was waiting on Earth for her mother to come home. She did not know that her mother was a prisoner. She did not know that an alien empress had just offered a terrible bargain that could determine whether Lara ever saw her daughter again. Daniel pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to push away the images that kept flooding his mind. The Empress had given him an impossible choice. He could save 30,000 strangers by condemning one person to a lifetime of slavery, or he could refuse and watch an entire colony burn while he remained helpless in his cell. The logical part of his brain whispered that the math was simple. One life against 30,000. Even if he chose Lara, or the old woman, or the Volanti dissident, the scales would still tip heavily in favor of saving the colony. Any reasonable person would make that trade without hesitation. But Daniel was not thinking about math. He was thinking about his grandfather. His grandfather's name was Henry Harper, and he had been a Navy chaplain for 30 years before retiring to a small house by the sea. Daniel had spent summers with him as a child, learning to fish and swim and navigate by the stars. But mostly, he had learned to play chess. His grandfather had been a patient teacher. He never got angry when Daniel made mistakes, never mocked him for falling into obvious traps. He simply reset the board and started again, explaining what had gone wrong and how to do better next time. One evening, when Daniel was 12 years old, his grandfather had taught him a lesson that had nothing to do with chess. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the ocean, when Henry had spoken without preamble. A man who trades his honor for comfort will lose both in the end. The old man had said, "Remember that, Danny. There will come a day when someone offers you an easy way out of a hard situation. They will tell you that the ends justify the means, that a small evil is acceptable if it leads to a greater good. They will make it sound reasonable, even noble." His grandfather had turned to look at him then, his eyes serious and sad. But it is a lie. Evil is evil, no matter how you dress it up. And once you cross that line, once you decide that some lives matter less than others, you will never be able to cross back. You will have become something you cannot live with. Daniel had not fully understood those words at 12, but he understood them now. The Empress was not just testing his willingness to sacrifice. She was testing his soul. She wanted to see if humans were like all the other species she had conquered, willing to throw away their principles when the pressure became great enough. She wanted proof that humanity was no different from the Volanti, just younger and weaker and easier to control. If Daniel chose a victim, he would save New Canton. But he would also prove the Empress right. He would become exactly what she expected him to be. The night passed slowly in the darkness of his cell. Daniel did not sleep. He could not sleep. He spent the hours remembering every person he had ever loved, every lesson he had ever learned, every moment that had shaped him into the man he had become. He thought about his parents, his sister, his grandfather, who had died peacefully in his sleep 3 years ago. He thought about Laura and Sophie and Captain Floppy the Purple Rabbit. And somewhere in the deepest part of the night, Daniel made his decision. He would not choose. He could not choose. Because choosing meant becoming something less than human, and that was a price he was not willing to pay. Not for his freedom. Not even for 30,000 lives. When the guards came for him at dawn, Daniel stood ready. His hands were steady, his heart was calm, and his eyes held a peace that surprised even himself. He knew what he was about to do. He knew what it might cost. But for the first time since his capture, he felt truly free. The throne room was crowded when Daniel arrived. Word had spread through the ship overnight, and every Velante who could find an excuse to be present had gathered to watch the human make his choice. They lined the walls in their flowing robes, their black eyes glittering with anticipation. Advisors and generals stood near the throne itself, whispering to each other behind raised hands. Even the servants had paused in their duties to witness what promised to be excellent. Entertainment. Daniel walked through the center of the room with his head held high. The guards had not bothered to chain him this time. Perhaps they thought he was already defeated. Perhaps they simply did not see him as a threat. Either way, he was grateful for the freedom of movement. It made what he was about to do feel slightly less like surrender. Empress Seraphil sat upon her crystal throne, wearing robes of deep blue that matched the floating lights above her head. Her crown caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. She looked beautiful and terrible, like a goddess from some ancient myth. And Daniel understood why her people had followed her for 800 years. She was power made flesh, and she knew it. "The human has returned," Seraphil announced, her soft voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "He has had all night to consider my offer. Let us see what he has decided." She rose from her throne and descended the steps slowly, savoring the moment. The crowd fell silent, holding their breath. This was what they had come to see. This was the entertainment they craved. Seraphil stopped directly in front of Daniel, close enough that he could smell the strange perfume she wore. It smelled like flowers and metal, and something older than either. Something that made his skin crawl in ways he could not explain. "You can choose any woman you want." "Human," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Point to one, and you will be free. A ship will be waiting to carry you to your colony. You will be a hero to your people, the man who saved 30,000 lives. All you have to do is make one small sacrifice." Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the cruelty behind those black eyes, the centuries of manipulation and murder that had brought her to this throne. He saw a creature who had forgotten what it meant to value life, who viewed other beings as pieces in a game that only she truly understood. He saw a monster wearing the face of a queen, and he saw something else. Something hidden so deep that perhaps even Seraphil herself had forgotten it was there. He saw loneliness. He saw emptiness. He saw a being who had lived so long and conquered so much that nothing surprised her anymore. Nothing challenged her anymore. Nothing made her feel alive anymore. She was not just testing him. She was hoping he would prove her wrong about the universe. She was hoping, in some secret corner of her ancient heart, that there was still something in existence worth believing in. Daniel took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The crowd leaned forward. The advisors stopped whispering. Even the floating lights seemed to dim, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "I choose honor," Daniel said. The words hung in the air like thunder. The translator device on his collar struggled with the concept, producing a phrase in the Volanti language that seemed to confuse everyone who heard it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Advisors exchanged bewildered glances. Even the guards behind Daniel shifted uncomfortably, uncertain what was happening. Seraphel's smile flickered. "What did you say?" Daniel spoke again, louder this time. "I choose honor. I will not point at any woman in your dungeons. I will not condemn any innocent person to slavery, not to save my own life, and not to save my colony. That is my answer." The murmurs grew louder. A Volanti general near the throne laughed, a harsh and mocking sound, but no one else joined him. They were watching Seraphel, waiting to see how she would respond. The Empress took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "You understand what you are saying. You are choosing to let 30,000 of your own people die. You are choosing to remain a prisoner in my dungeons until your body fails and your spirit breaks. You are throwing away everything for the sake of a word." "I understand," Daniel said. "But you do not." He looked past her, addressing the crowd that filled the throne room. "Every person in those dungeons has a name. They have families who love them, friends who miss them, dreams they have not yet fulfilled. They are not pieces in a game. They are not resources to be traded. They are living beings with souls, and I do not have the right to decide that any of them matters less than me." He turned back to Seraphel. "If New Canton burns, the blood will be on your hands, not mine. You are the one who ordered the attack. You are the one who refuses to let innocent people live in peace. I will not take responsibility for your evil, just because you gave me a choice between bad options." Seraphel stared at him. For the first time since Daniel had entered her throne room, she seemed uncertain. The game was not playing out the way she had expected. "You would really let them die," she said slowly. 30,000 men, women, and children, screaming as the fire takes them. You would carry that weight for the rest of your life, just to avoid making a hard choice. Daniel nodded. "I would spend every remaining breath trying to find another way to stop you. I would fight you with everything I have. But I will not become a monster to defeat a monster. That is what separates humans from you." The throne room erupted in noise. Some Volanti were shouting in outrage, demanding that the insolent human be executed immediately. Others were silent, staring at Daniel with expressions that might have been confusion or might have been something else entirely. The general who had laughed earlier was not laughing anymore, but Daniel was not watching the crowd. He was watching Seraphl, and in those ancient black eyes, hidden beneath centuries of cruelty and power, he saw something flicker. It was small and brief, gone almost before it appeared. But Daniel saw it clearly. It was respect. The Empress raised one hand, and the throne room fell silent instantly. Her face was unreadable, a mask of royal composure that revealed nothing of her thoughts. But when she spoke, her voice was different, softer, almost gentle. "Leave us," she said. "All of you, now." The crowd obeyed without question. Within minutes, the throne room was empty except for Daniel, Seraphel, and a single scarred advisor who remained stubbornly at his Empress's side. And in the sudden silence, Seraphel began to smile. Not the cruel smile of a predator, but something older and sadder and infinitely more human. "You," she said quietly, "are the most interesting thing I have encountered in 400 years." The sky above was orange and pink, painted by a setting sun that was not Earth's sun, but felt familiar nonetheless. Daniel Harper stood on the rocky ground of an unnamed moon, breathing air that tasted of dust and freedom, watching the Volanti mothership rise slowly into the heavens. The massive vessel climbed higher and higher until it was just a dark shape against the colors of sunset. And then it vanished in a flash of light as it jumped into hyperspace. 3 days. It had been 3 days since Daniel had refused the Empress's offer. 3 days since Seraphil had ordered his release. 3 days since he had walked out of the throne room and into a new chapter of his life. The Volanthi had been surprisingly efficient once the Empress gave her orders. Guards had escorted Daniel through the winding corridors of the mothership, gathering his crew members one by one from their scattered cells. Laura Webb had been the first to join him, her green eyes wide with disbelief when she saw him walking free. Then came the others. The navigator, Kyle Preston, with his quick smile and nervous hands. The engineer, Maria Santos, who had cried when she realized they were actually being released. The medic, Sam Turner, who had immediately started checking everyone for injuries. One by one, the crew of the Horizon's Edge reunited. 12 humans standing together in the loading bay of an alien ship, struggling to understand their impossible good fortune. The Volanthi had given them a small transport vessel, nothing fancy but fully functional. They had stocked it with food, water, and fuel for the journey home. They had even returned their personal belongings, the photographs and letters and small treasures that the crew had carried with them from Earth. And then, without ceremony or farewell, the Volanthi had let them go. The transport vessel was now sitting behind Daniel, its engines cooling after the short flight from orbit to the moon's surface. The crew had decided to stop here for a few hours, to stretch their legs and breathe real air and convince themselves that this was not all some elaborate dream. Most of them were gathered near the ship, talking quietly, processing everything that had happened. But Daniel had walked away from the group. He needed a moment alone. He needed to think. Footsteps crunched on the rocky ground behind him. He did not need to turn around to know who it was. Laura Webb had always been able to find him, even in the darkest corners of the galaxy. She came to stand beside him, watching the last colors of sunset fade from the alien sky. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, the kind of silence that exists between people who have known each other for years. "The crew is asking about you," Laura finally said. "They want to thank you properly. They are calling you a hero." Daniel shook his head. "I am not a hero. I am just a man who made a choice." Laura turned to look at him, her green eyes serious. "I heard what happened in the throne room. The guards who released me could not stop talking about it. They said you refused to choose. They said you told the Empress that every life matters equally." "That is true," Daniel said. "They said you would have let New Canton burn rather than point at one of us." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, I would have." Laura did not respond right away. She seemed to be thinking, weighing his words, trying to understand something that was larger than words could express. "Sophie is going to want to meet you," she finally said. "When we get back to Earth, she has never met a real hero before." Daniel smiled despite himself. "I told you, I am not a hero. I just could not live with the alternative. My grandfather taught me that some things are worth more than survival. Honor, dignity, the ability to look at yourself in the mirror without shame. If I had pointed at someone, I would have saved New Canton. But I would have lost myself." Laura nodded slowly. "Sounds like your grandfather was a wise man." "He was," Daniel agreed. "He died 3 years ago. But sometimes I still hear his voice in my head, telling me what to do when things get hard. He's the reason I made the choice I made." They stood together in the growing darkness, watching the stars emerge one by one above the alien horizon. Somewhere out there, New Canton was safe. 30,000 people would never know how close they had come to destruction. They would never know that their survival was a gift from an ancient empress who had been reminded what honor meant. Daniel wondered what would happen next. Seraphil had let them go, but the Volanthi Empire was vast and old, and filled with factions that might not agree with their empress's sudden change of heart. Torvax had not seemed pleased by the decision. There would be consequences, probably. Political struggles and power plays and all the complications that came with ruling a galaxy-spanning civilization. But that was not Daniel's problem. His problem was getting his crew home safely. His problem was returning to Earth and filing reports and explaining to his superiors how he had managed to escape from the most powerful empire in known space. His problem was figuring out what came next for a man who had faced the ultimate test and somehow passed. "The others are waiting," Laura said gently. "We should get back to the ship. It is a long journey home." Daniel took one last look at the stars. Somewhere out there, Seraphil was sitting on her crystal throne, perhaps staring at the same stars and thinking about the same questions. He hoped she found the answers she was looking for. He hoped the Volanti could learn to be something better than what they had become. And he hoped, more than anything, that his grandfather would have been proud of him. "Let us go home," he said. They walked back to the transport vessel together, their footsteps crunching on alien rock, their shadows long in the light of rising moons. The crew gathered around as they approached, faces weary but hopeful, ready to begin the journey back to everything they had left behind. Kyle was already at the controls when Daniel climbed aboard. The engines hummed to life, and the small vessel lifted off, rising through the atmosphere and into the darkness of space. Earth was weeks away, but for the first time in months, Daniel felt like he could wait. He took his seat in the cockpit beside Laura and watched the stars streak past the viewscreen as they jumped to hyperspace. Behind them, on the unnamed moon, the Volanti mothership was already forgotten. Ahead of them lay home, family, and all the ordinary wonders of a life that had been returned to them against all odds. But Daniel knew that nothing would ever be truly ordinary again. He had seen what was possible when someone chose principle over survival. He had seen an ancient empress question everything she believed because one human refused to betray his values. The story would spread. He knew that too. The Volanti guards had been talking about him before he even left the ship. Traders and diplomats and travelers would carry the tale from star to star. Eventually, every species in the galaxy would hear about the human who chose honor. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would understand what it meant. Daniel leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, feeling the hum of the engines through the hull, feeling the warmth of his crew around him, feeling the quiet certainty that he had done the right thing. The universe was vast and dark and full of dangers, but it was also full of possibilities. And as long as there were people willing to stand for what was right, there was hope for everyone, even for an empress who had forgotten how to hope, even for a species that had only just begun to reach for the stars. Daniel smiled in the darkness of the cockpit, thinking about his grandfather, thinking about Sophie and her purple rabbit, thinking about all the adventures that still lay ahead. The story was just beginning. The throne room felt different now that it was empty. The floating lights had dimmed to a soft purple glow, and shadows pooled in the corners like dark water. Daniel stood alone before the Empress, watched only by the scarred advisor who had refused to leave his ruler's side. The advisor's name was Torvax. Daniel had heard it whispered during his captivity, always with a note of fear in the voice. Torvax was old, even by Volanti standards. His gray skin was marked with dozens of battle scars, and his left eye was gone, replaced by a mechanical implant that glowed faintly red in the dim light. He was the Empress's oldest friend and most trusted warrior, and he was clearly unhappy with how this situation was developing. Empress, Torvax said, his voice rough with age and concern. This is a waste of time. The human is either lying or insane. Either way, he serves no purpose. Let me take him back to the dungeons and proceed with the attack as planned. Seraphil raised one hand, silencing him. She descended from her throne and walked slowly toward Daniel, her robes whispering against the polished floor. For centuries, she said, I have tested countless species. I have offered them power, wealth, freedom, pleasure. I have given them choices designed to reveal their true nature. And every single one has chosen self-interest. She stopped in front of Daniel, studying his face with those ancient black eyes. The Carthosi sold their own children to escape my dungeons. The Velith traded their homeworld's location for safe passage. Even my own people, when tested, chose survival over principle. Every species I have encountered has proven that intelligence and civilization are just masks we wear to hide the animals underneath. Daniel said nothing. He simply waited, sensing that something important was happening, something he did not fully understand. Seraphel continued, her voice growing quieter. Your species was supposed to be no different. Our scientists studied humanity for decades before we made contact. They analyzed your history, your art, your wars, your religions. They concluded that humans were driven by the same basic impulses as every other species. Fear, greed, the desire for dominance. They said you would be easy to manipulate. She paused, and something flickered in her eyes. But I wanted to see for myself. I have lived too long to trust reports from scientists. So I chose you, Daniel Harper. I chose you because my observers told me you shared your food with weaker prisoners. Because you tried to protect your crew during interrogation. Because you spoke kindly to the guards, even when they treated you poorly. Torvax made a sound of disgust. Weakness, he said. Those are signs of weakness, not virtue. Perhaps Seraphel agreed. Or perhaps they are signs of something else. Something we have forgotten. She turned away from Daniel and walked to the wall where a massive painting hung. It depicted a battle scene. Thousands of Volanti soldiers charging across a burning landscape. Seraphel studied it for a long moment before speaking again. Do you know why the Volanti Empire has lasted for 12,000 years? She asked. Daniel shook his head. I always assumed it was because you were stronger than everyone else. Seraphel laughed, a soft and bitter sound. Strength fades. Empires built on strength alone crumble the moment a stronger force appears. No, we have lasted because we have no limits. We are willing to do anything, sacrifice anything, to achieve our goals. We traded away our compassion long ago, our mercy, our honor. We told ourselves these things were weaknesses, and we cut them out of our culture like tumors. She turned back to face Daniel. And it worked. We conquered the galaxy. We became gods. But somewhere along the way, we forgot why we wanted to conquer in the first place. We forgot what we were fighting for. We became empty. Daniel Harper. Hollow. We won everything and lost ourselves. Daniel felt the weight of her words pressing against him. He understood now why she had offered him that impossible choice. It was not cruelty, not entirely. It was desperation. You wanted me to prove you wrong, he said quietly. You wanted to see if any species still remembered what honor meant. Seraphel nodded slowly. I wanted proof that the universe still contained something worth believing in. Something that could not be bought or threatened or manipulated. I wanted to know if it was possible to be strong and good at the same time. And now? Daniel asked. Now I have my answer. She returned to her throne and sat down, arranging her robes carefully. Torvax watched her with growing alarm, clearly sensing that something significant was about to happen. Empress, he said carefully, whatever you are planning, I urge you to reconsider. The Council will not approve of any deviation from our strategy. The Council, Seraphel replied coldly, can challenge me in the arena if they disapprove. I am still the Empress, and my word is law. She looked at Daniel with an expression he had never seen on a Volanti face before. It took him a moment to recognize it as hope. Release him, she ordered. Release his entire crew. Give them a ship and supplies for their journey home. Torvax stared at her in disbelief. Empress, that is 12 humans. The breeding program alone requires at least half of them. Cancel the breeding program. Seraphel said. Cancel it all, and send a warning to the human colony on New Canton. Tell them the Volanthi fleet is standing down. The attack will not happen. The throne room fell silent. Torvax looked as though he had been struck by lightning. Daniel felt his heart pounding in his chest, hardly daring to believe Why? He asked. Why are you doing this? Seraphel smiled, and for a moment she looked almost kind. Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten, she said. You reminded me that some things are more valuable than victory. Some principles are worth more than power. You chose honor over survival, Daniel Harper. That is not weakness. That is the greatest strength I have ever witnessed. She leaned back in her throne, and her eyes grew distant. Perhaps it is time for the Volanthi to learn that lesson again. Perhaps it is time for us to remember what we lost. Torvax opened his mouth to protest, but Seraphel silenced him with a look. Do not test me, old friend, she said quietly. I have made my decision. The humans go free. The attack is cancelled, and anyone who challenges my authority will answer for it personally. Torvax bowed his head, defeated. As you command. Empress. Daniel stood frozen in the center of the throne room, trying to process what had just happened. He had walked into this room expecting to die. He had refused the Empress's offer, knowing that it might cost him everything. And now, against all odds, he had won. But it did not feel like victory. It felt like something more important than that. It felt like a beginning. Go home, Daniel Harper, Seraphel said. Tell your people what happened here. Tell them that the Volanthi are not as unchanging as we appear. And tell them that somewhere in the darkness of space, there is an Empress who is learning to hope again. Daniel bowed his head in respect. Thank you, he said. Seraphel's smile widened. Do not thank me yet. You still have a long journey ahead of you. And the universe is full of dangers far worse than me. She waved one hand, dismissing him. The guards will escort you to your crew. Your ship is waiting. Daniel turned and walked toward the massive doors, his steps echoing in the empty throne room. Behind him, he heard Seraphel speak one last time, her voice soft and almost wondering. Honor, she murmured. Such a small word for such a powerful thing. Daniel did not look back, but he smiled as he walked, and for the first time in 3 months, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter than air.